Okay, so a little bit of the details. If mail comes into you, and it has a DKIM signature, you have to validate the signature, because that's the only way you're going to know whether you can believe the domain name. And to do that, you need a public key that's controlled by whoever signed the message. And one of the innovations of DKIM is that it places the public key into the DNS. Uses a TXT record for this. There are some naming conventions for where it's placed and how. The placement for the original technology, which was domain keys done by Yahoo, was that it was tied to the from or sender, depending on how you want to talk about it, domain name. DKIM doesn't do that. The DKIM has a header field that is DKIM-signature, and it tells you what the domain name is that the key is stored under, and that's the D= parameter. And so you go look under there, and there's some extra conventions for getting to exactly the right place. And it has an interesting feature, which is called a selector, that lets you have multiple keys associated with the same domain name. And there's two different reasons you want to do that. One is that you want to be able to rotate in new keys, just as an administrative process of refreshing keys that might have been compromised and replacing them with new ones. And so you can have two different selectors, they give you two different keys, but they really are validating the same domain name. The other is, you may want to have different agents who are authorized to sign under that domain name and want to be able to turn off particular ones. And this is not very different from card keys that we have, which give lots of people access to the same room, but you can turn any one of them off administratively. Parameters aren't very interesting. Sorry. Murray said, well, there goes my job. Okay, the process of signing the message and verifying is classic for this kind of technology, or this kind of crypto. And that is, you administratively have to select the private and public key. You have to decide on the domain name you're going to have that you're signing under. And this is the DKIM parameter, not the from field. Once more, it has nothing to do with from field. You have to choose the selector. And by the way, it should be clear, all I'm trying to accomplish right now is give you a sense of the administrative and operational overhead. Because each of the things I'm mentioning means there's some procedure, there's possibly some database, and so on and so forth. So it's not so much the algorithms, it's the procedures. And then you have to decide what header fields to sign. DKIM lets you say, you don't have to do the calculations over the entire message. You can choose some of the header fields, and in fact, you can choose only an initial part of the body. And there's nuances to why you might do all of the body or only part of the body. There is little guidance that's available for why you should choose particular header fields over others. There is a common view for those people who think that DKIM is protecting the message, that you should sign all of the really important header fields. There's another view which says, all I'm doing is trying to validate the domain name, which says, well, it should be an interesting set of header fields, but it's not necessarily real important which ones you choose. The single most important thing about choosing header fields is you want to make sure they're not going to be corrupted in transit. And so fields that are subject to change in transit will break your signature. For example, if you include the subject field and the message goes through an email relay, a mailing list relay, and it puts in the bracket, list name bracket, as is common in subject fields, that will break the signature. And you might say, well, but if I'm not protecting the subject field, what am I doing? And the answer is, you're validating a domain name. You're not validating the content. There is, I think, a requirement in the spec that you include the from field. No comment. So you make those administrative decisions from the first bullet. You compute actually two hashes, one for the header field set and the other for the body. And then you encrypt this stuff in the way these technologies work for doing signing. And you create the DKIM signature field that you stuff the parameters into, including the signature value. On the receive side, it's essentially the reverse process. Any questions? Yes?
Could you just say
Did I say that the signing the from field is a normative requirement of DKIM? And I did say that I was pretty sure that was right. It is right. And we went through enough iterations. I tend to forget where the group decision lands after a long design debate. And I couldn't quite remember. But it actually got a little worse than that. I think from is clearly mandatory. The spec ended up at the very final stages having some quirkiness to this bit of what the requirements were. And it appears to require more than that, but the surrounding language is incredibly waffly. And this was because we had an ITF area director who at the last minute decided to get difficult. And this was to assuage her. So the reality is it's waffly enough that sign whatever you think you should sign. That's, and it may be, in fact, important for you to be careful about it, and it might not. We've had informal questions to the community about how much they care what fields are signed, and my recollection is we haven't had any strong indication that receive side cares much yet. Now, as DKIM use gets solidified down certain paths, then it may become really quite important. But Steve?
I've seen some people say that they'd really like to see the subject signed.
So Steve is saying he's seen some people say they'd really like to see the subject signed. And that doesn't surprise me. Note what I said about mail going through mailing lists, and that leads to this whole other discussion about signatures surviving mailing lists. Yes?
I've been trying to arrive at kind of balance between deciding just how much to validate and how much it's actually feasible to validate when you're dealing with a large mail stream.
So
example,
so you're asking about deciding how much to validate and then deciding how much is practical.
Look at it this way, like some particular sender or Yahoo or somebody else sends me like huge amounts, hundreds of thousands, millions of mails, whatever a day.
So, but your question is basically about the computational overhead?
Yes,
Fine,
again
thank
and
you.
again and again.
So, thank you. In the relatively early days after stabilizing the spec, and I maintain the dkim.org webpage, so occasionally people contact me for information or provide information. A random guy who had no history in the DKIM community, and as I recall, he's from Germany, contacted me saying, oh, I've just written this paper you might want to put on your website. And the main focus of the paper was discussing the computational overhead of DKIM and why you don't need to be worried about it. The normal assumption is, oh, this is public key computation, very expensive, got to be careful. The reality is there also was a study done by Yahoo when they first started doing this, because they had internal debates. And Yahoo, in their original work, and I believe computationally there's likely to be no meaningful difference in the overhead between the original domain keys and the current DKIM. Yahoo's estimate was that they would have to buy $100,000 worth of extra hardware. And in the scheme of the scale that Yahoo works in, that's not really an interesting amount of money. But it turned out they didn't have to buy any more at all. The particulars about what's available in most compute centers that process mail in terms of resources is they're I/O bound, which means they have some CPU capacity, and this is more CPU oriented. So the choice of what headers to sign, I would expect, would make no difference on your throughput. Thank you. So like any good spec, there's a bunch of parameters, and some of them are optional. That doesn't mean they're interesting, and a lot of them might not even be important. Some of us wanted to go do a revision to DKIM that said that got rid of the parameters that were not really essential, and but not only are they not important, they weren't important enough for people to get motivated to remove them. This is my list of ones that I think are reasonable to worry about. I believe everything in here is self-explanatory and therefore not interesting, unless somebody wants to ask a question. Okay. So there was a comment earlier about mail streams in the matrix that I showed, and I want to go back to that because the fact that you can affix any domain name you have control over onto the DKIM signature, and it doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with the from field or sender field or mail from or eHello, means that the originator might want to differentiate different kinds of mail streams. It also means a signature might be by an intermediary like the operator or someone else. You can even have an independent third party, such as a reputation organization, sign the message. But it also means you can not only affix the domain name you want, you can affix the subdomain name you want. Because as far as an exercise like this goes, everything is a subdomain. It's underneath root. And so the fact that you might have ownership over a particular subdomain, such as your company domain name, you can choose to have subdomains under that and use the different domain names to distinguish different mail streams. Corporate mail needs to get through. It needs a reputation that's pristine, which was one of the words from the Matrix. My Matrix, not the movie. We're working on it. Whereas transactional mail needs to be absolutely pristine and get through. It's really important that get delivered. Marketing mail, no matter how well run, is likely to have more difficulty in life because marketing people deserve it. Oh, sorry, no, not true. And I'm on the technical side. One of my obligations in life is to hassle marketing people. I have this other direction I can go about how difficult marketing is to do well, but that's not the goal right now. So you can use different labels to build up different reputations for different mail streams. And it's a major feature, in my view, of what DKIM can do. I haven't seen or heard much about people experimenting with this, because we still don't have a lot of people stepping up and talking about using DKIM for reputation. What we heard the last session was using it for the feedback loop, and that's a kind of reputation. But it's more about legitimacy than goodness, in my view. Okay, and that's the point of that slide. ADSP is on the opposite side of the trust equation. It's looking for bad actors, and the way it's doing that is that all this freedom about the domain name that I said goes away. You say the domain name that is in the from field is the domain name I'm going to sign with, and I'm going to publish a record that says I do this. And in fact, I might even set that record to say I always do this. If you see my domain name in the from field, I will sign the message. If you see my domain name in the from field and it's not signed, it's not from me. And I can even go farther and say, and if that happens, please throw the message away. You might choose to believe me or not. Now, one small wrinkle comes into this very, very clean model, and that is people set this record incorrectly. I may think I know everything about the mail world that I'm sending from, and that I can guarantee that all my mail is going to be signed, all my legitimate mail is going to be signed. The reality is we already have lots of examples of people who misconfigure this. The receiver, you might say, is going to go, well, you told me to throw away, I'll throw it away. And if the originator of the message were the agent that the receiver was accountable to, that would be a good answer, maybe, probably. Unfortunately, receivers are not accountable to the senders, they're accountable to their customers. And customers have this nasty habit of saying, you threw away a legitimate piece of mail, I'm unhappy with you, you need to not do that. And the response of, well, but the other guy told me to, doesn't fly. And I will tell you that this reality of email operations was true 30 years ago. It has not gotten any better. One of the reasons email protocols tend to have some flexibility in the way they're written, never mind how they're interpreted, is because of this support problem. Is the accountability chain stops at the receiving operator. Nonetheless, the model I gave you is the way ADSP, author domain signing practices, was defined and is standardized and is available. And there's some deployment of it and lots of debate about how useful it is. So we have, I'm probably over. So we have a signing specification, and we've had a small revision to it that's been published, and they're all standards track. We have an effort to go underway to clean things up maybe a little bit. None of that will really affect interoperability. I'm quite sure of that. We have, I didn't mention, there's an overview document, which is a kind of tutorial about DKIM. And we have a deployment document that is stable enough that I encourage people doing operations to look at it. ADSP I mentioned. And the thing that we haven't been able to get much traction on is that next step, which is if you're signing mail, so what? What good is that? Because knowing that there's a domain name attached to a message doesn't sound like it's particularly useful, because it isn't. It's doing something with that domain name and getting some convention so that when I send you a message and I decide to put a domain name on it, I have some expectation for what my putting that domain name on means. And I don't mean I'm taking some responsibility, but rather that domain name carries some implications that you, the receiver, are going to share with me. Whether it's that domain name shows up in a set of reputation services that say I'm a good guy, or whether it's I've registered for feedback loops on major carriers, or something else. And the FBL use is about the only thing that seems to have become fairly significant to operations for the use of DKIM. By and large, what's tended to happen is people on the receive side are looking at DKIM signatures and trying to develop a traffic history to make some assessments, very much the way, identical to the way things have been done with IP addresses. What we haven't had is going back to that collaborative model where there's intermediate mechanisms sort of short of hiring a reputation service, but able to give you something that's useful that you can feed into your reputation, into your handling engine. And that's really the next stage, and getting some traction on doing that is a point of continuing debate. These slides will be available. These are a bunch of references. If you go to dkim.org, you'll find all of this. Any questions? Any comments? Yes?
ADSP, you said this is what the standard supports, but people do it wrong, and I just want to speak in favor of ADSP because we're doing it at PayPal, and we believe that it's one way to establish on the record as a sender that we're doing it right, call us on it. We're trying to protect our customers, which are your customers too.
Okay, so and since I have to repeat things for the microphone, for the recording, PayPal is using ADSP and believes that it's a good thing. If mail is signed when it's sent, will it be signed when it's received? And that actually comes in two parts. Will there be a signature, and will it validate? And I made some reference to the fact that signatures can be broken in transit. I gave the simple example of a mailing list that might affix something to the subject, and if the subject is one of the header fields that's in your hash, then it will, the change to the subject field will break the signature. And so the answer is, it depends, and we don't really have data on when it's broken and when it's not. We have very knowledgeable people who have recited what they know will break a signature and that they know occurs in some scenarios. What we don't have is any documentation of where there are problems with DKIM signatures and where there are not. And that would be, I think, a useful thing to come up with. Yes?
So you mentioned about you're looking for traction on the assessment of DKIM outside the technical side of things.
Assessments that use DKIM. DKIM's wonderful. We don't need to assess that.
Right. Okay. So a little bit of conjecture on my end from what I see And what seems is my perception in the sending industry, and that is that senders are using DKIM as part of a reputation metric. So again, you know, there's best practices. There's things you can do on managing lists, managing hygiene, and so senders, in an effort to try and do things that, to follow best practices, will sign DKIM, even if they're using, you know, if everything else is crappy. At least they can do DKIM, so you know they can raise that reputation up a notch.